Hey everyone, I'm Ben, the amateur exegete, and this is episode 51 of Bible Study for Amateurs. Today's episode is Dear Philemon. Starting today and over the course of the next 10 episodes, we're going to look at the Apostle Paul's letter to Philemon. As we did in the series of episodes looking at the Epistle of Jude, we'll be using some of the tools from my amateur toolbox that I mentioned in episodes 11 to 20 of this podcast. If you haven't had a chance to listen to those episodes, take some time to do so, as they'll give you an overview of the various tools, commentaries, introductions, study Bibles that I find useful when researching a biblical text. So why Philemon? It isn't as exhilarating as the book of Revelation. It lacks the narrative excitement of, say, the Gospels. It's not even doctrinally rich, like the book of Hebrews or Paul's letter to the Galatians. Why then do a series on Philemon? For starters, it's short. At roughly 330 words, it's longer than the letters of 2nd or 3rd John, but shorter than the Epistle of Jude. In the words of Bart Ehrman in his introduction to the New Testament, the letter to Philemon is the size of an average Greco-Roman letter. We know quite a bit about letters in the period wherein Paul wrote. Phebe Perkins in the New Oxford Annotated Bible observes that there were many different kinds of Greco-Roman letters in antiquity. Imperial decrees, collections of philosophical letters, and letters from ordinary people to ordinary people about all sorts of ordinary concerns. Paul's letter fits squarely into that final category, though it ended up in a collection of letters we call the Pauline corpus. Another reason to examine the letter to Philemon is how personal and practical it is. All of the undisputed letters of Paul, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, and 1st Thessalonians, are written to Christ-following assemblies at large, except Philemon, though other recipients are mentioned in the letter's salutation, including the church in your house. It's evident from the rest of the letter that Paul has his sights set on Philemon. Even the phrase, the church in your house, suggests this, since the your there is singular, not plural. But it is not only personal because it zeroes in on a single person, Philemon, but also because of the manner in which Paul writes. For example, in his appeal to Philemon, Paul employs kinship language, describing himself as an old man in verse 9 and referring to Onesimus, the slave of Philemon, as his child and himself as father. Additionally, Paul writes in a conciliatory way, seemingly trying to placate Philemon in light of whatever wrong Onesimus has committed against him. He even refers to himself as Philemon's partner, using a term he employed at times when writing about Titus in 2 Corinthians 8 verse 23, or of assemblies in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 verse 4 and Philippians chapter 4 verse 15. Much more could be said on these points, though we should be cautious lest we fail to see both Paul as pastor and Paul as possessor of power. Both are at play in Paul's words. As Ronald Hawk notes in the Harper Collins Study Bible, the letter is a masterpiece of church diplomacy. Another reason, the final one that we'll consider, for choosing the letter to Philemon as the subject of the next several episodes of Bible Study for Amateurs is summed up by Eric Barreto in his commentary on the epistle for the Fortress Commentary on the Bible. He writes, "The 25 verses of Philemon have had an outsized influence on our culture and history." Margaret Mitchell, in her introduction to Philemon for the New Oxford Annotated Bible, offers a similar view. This letter, she writes, has played a role in the history of Christian social ethics disproportionate to its size. To what are these scholars referring? While we will get into this subject a bit more in later episodes, the Epistle of Philemon is a hermeneutical hotbed because of the issue of slavery, both ancient and modern. Writing in the Women's Bible Commentary, Mitzi Smith notes that during the 19th century, apologists for slavery in the antebellum period, that is, the period before the American Civil War, put Paul's letter to Philemon to poignant use. They interpreted and used Philemon as an amicus curiae, friend of the court, brief, supporting the slavocracy and the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. She goes on to explain that the Fugitive Slave Act allowed slavers to track down slaves that had escaped bondage and re-enslave them. She also writes that Philemon had a place not only in the pro-slavery crowd, but also the anti-slavery one. For such a tiny epistle to have the kind of sway that it did vindicates both Barretto's and Mitchell's thoughts on its surprising influence. Slavery is a topic we will touch on in later episodes, especially since apologists have tried to soften Greco-Roman slavery in a bid to rescue both the Apostle Paul and the early Christ-following movement. For now, it suffices to say that while slavery in antiquity and slavery in the modern era and the United States prior to the Civil War share many differences, they also share many similarities. Slavery was a horrible institution, and it often involved abuse of all sorts. We should decry it wherever we find it, whether in the sermons of the pro-slavery Southern pastors in the antebellum period, or in the writings of the Apostle Paul. That's all the time we've got this week. See you next time. And remember, in the words of Richard Elliott Friedman, one does not need to deny what is troubling about the Bible in order to pay respect to what is heartening. Thanks for stopping by.